Welcome to the EV Ready podcast, featuring industry leaders and their perspectives on electrification, hosted by EV Ready Energy. Hey, everybody. Welcome to the EV Ready podcast. I'm grateful and excited to have Marie Raphael, National Grid Electrification Program Manager, on the call today to talk a little bit about the electrification industry, what she's doing at National Grid, and get her take on things. So thank you, Marie, so much for joining.
Well, thank you for having me, Chris.
Yeah, this is awesome. I love having people on at the utilities because I think in many cases, the importance of the utility isn't always understood tied to the project initially. And National Grid is at the forefront of progression around electrification and some of the things that the company's doing. So I couldn't be more grateful to have you on and have a representative of National Grid on to kind of talk about where we are today. But to kick it off, can you tell us a little bit about yourself and your history?
Sure. So I'm actually a program manager for the workplace and public EV charging station program that we have. We grew our little group. We only had 3 or 4 folks. Now we doubled in size for phase 3. But as for me, myself, I started off working for National Grid years ago. I won't say how many, but a while ago, back in before 2000, before the turn of the century anyway. And I started off, I had a little bit of a very short stint in customer service, which was great because it really gives you an idea of what customers are dealing with. And from there, I went on to what we called conservation and load management at the time. So it was a brand new program. And we were one of the first utilities, in Massachusetts, to offer that rebate programs for putting in energy efficient lighting or energy efficient equipment. And from there, I went on to more of a business, working directly with businesses and having a certain group of businesses and dealing with everything from a new construction project coming through their town to a problem with their bill or a floodlight out at the mayor's house, all those kind of issues. So very well rounded in that respect. And then we reorganized several times. And so from there, I went on to small business, managing some small businesses. And then I became a manager of what we call our Project Expediter program. And that's a program, it's also energy efficiency based, where we hire a group, or we don't hire them because we don't pay them for these services, but we go out to bid and we get a group of external vendors who act as a sort of an extension of our own internal sales force, working with customers. And they do everything from helping the customer with the application process to installing the equipment, providing it. And then a lot of customers will then reassign their rebates to these vendors because they don't have to pay that up front, and it's a great process. And so it works out well. I did that for a number of years and then migrated over to our new EV charging station program in 2019. That's when we began with our phase 1 and offering it to commercial customers. We didn't offer rebates for DC fast charge stations, but we did for the infrastructure. We did offer rebates for level 2s and the infrastructure. So I've been there since we just got through phase 1, and we had a stretch goal of 680 stations to get installed. And we actually just crushed that with 989. So there was a lot of interest in EV charging stations. And it worked out well. It was, initial program, just getting our feet wet into that space. And now we just this year we're approved a phase 3 program. It's very similar, but there's some discrepancies in what we offer. And it's been a slow start because we didn't have a program for a year while we were waiting to get approved. But we're gradually building back that base, and hopefully we'll have that hockey stick coming up, getting so many more charging stations, charging ports installed. our just to give you an idea of magnitude, in phase one, it was about 21 million was the program size. And in phase three, it's 206 million. So our goals have increased by tenfold at least, and so has in our budget.
Got it. Got it. Yeah. And having participated in your program, it's just been over the past several years, it's been met with so much interest. And it's not shocking to hear the numbers that you're throwing out there, because I know how excited everybody is in the territory about using the program to install charging stations. And yeah, it's just been great. Can you tell us a little bit about the first program, like some of the successes of your first program, but maybe some things that you were looking to adjust in the second program, and how that second program is sort of materializing right now.
Yeah, the first program was, it was our, as I said, kind of getting our feet wet in that space in terms of offering rebates to customers. Um, what we decided to do right from the outset, which was one of the reasons why I came over, was to go out for an RFP and see if we could get some vendors, in that space. We have internal sales reps that handle, mostly large commercial customers. But as you know, a lot of these charging stations aren't necessarily installed there. They might be installed at these smaller mom and pop shops or 7-Eleven, or, so so it was a great way to expand our own internal sales force. And we brought on over 20 vendors to handle Massachusetts. And they, took the ball and ran with it. And a lot of them came from the EE space, the energy efficiency space, and now we're migrating into EVs. So they knew our programs, they knew, how we structured them, they knew our policies. And so it was a great fit to bring some of those folks over, and along with a bunch of new folks over into this space. And that really has worked out the best, because they've, out of all those 989 stations that we've paid, um, about 70% of those came from this group of vendors. So
Wow.
they were very instrumental in our program growth. And so, of course, we've continued that into phase three, because we know how important that is. Phase three, like I said, is tenfold. So I did not think that the percentage of what they carried would be as great, because it's just too much. And I just had a meeting the other day, and yep, they're at 70% of our much larger goal. So they're growing as well. And I think a lot of them have, adjusted internally to be able to meet those needs. So that was a big thing. Phase one, like I said, we worked with a lot of commercial, industrial. What we found is the municipal market was really growing in phase one. We had a ton of municipal projects. We also emphasize projects meeting an environmental justice criteria. Those projects we paid a little bit more money for. In phase three, we're actually expanding on that even further, especially if you meet what's called an income criteria. There are three criteria: income eligible, English isolation, and minority. And if you meet the income eligible, then that's where the largest rebates are. And that's so we're finding now in phase three, that has also expanded. We had about 40% of customers meeting one criteria in phase one. Now we're at like 60%. So people go where the money is. And also the flip side is, in phase one, we didn't offer funding for DC fast charge stations. We did for the infrastructure. In phase three, we are offering money for DC fast charge, and the charts have flipped. We were so far behind with DC fast charge. Out of the 989 in phase one, only 25 were DC fast charge. It's the exact opposite now. We're almost at least what we've received for applications, we're at like in 4/5, 2/3 of what we would hope to install. So not paid, only applied for. So it doesn't count until they're actually
Yeah.
installed and paid, which takes a while.
Yeah, yeah, I remember participating in that first program, and at that time it was 2017. The Model 3 was just getting released, or 2018 to 2020, whenever that was. But isn't it crazy how fast things change?
Oh yeah,
Or oh
yeah.
my goodness, it's just wild, and it's not surprising to hear because I think, obviously DC charging is a little bit more expensive, and I think National Grid has shown that they want to build public infrastructure that's available so that people can buy electric cars in the utility territory and other ones that are surrounding it and benefiting from the program as well, obviously. But can you help define for people that maybe don't know anything about the program and how it's structured? What is Make Ready? What is level two versus level three, and how you guys are trying to subsidize uh, charging infrastructure and potential solutions with the program?
Sure. There's a lot of questions in there. So
I don't make it easy.
I'm trying to remember what was the first one, but
The main one is this. If you can define the program for us,
yeah.
so that people understand it, that would be great.
All right. Well, our whole point as a utility is we know this is our business is installing electrical infrastructure. So it really makes sense for the utilities to be involved in this space. We feel like we're in a perfect position to expedite the installation of charging stations, increasing the number of ports in Massachusetts. The state has some pretty large targets where they want to get EVs off the road. I think by 2035 is Massachusetts state of only selling EVs. As a company internally, we're also right in line with that, and we're converting over our own fleet to electric vehicles. And we have a goal of, I believe it's 2030, to convert them all over to electric. So everybody's in that mindset now, and it's like you see in that hockey stick starting to rise. If you look at maps of Massachusetts where the EV drivers are, and you're seeing in some cities and towns it's up to 30%. So in others it's a lot lower. But so our whole purpose was to really clean up those greenhouse gas emissions. How can we get involved? And transportation is the biggest contributor, so that's where we feel we can really make an impact. So the way our program works is we provide funding for installing EV charging stations. And Chris, you referred to Make Ready. I don't really, that's a weird term, Make Ready. What does that mean? It's really the installation. It's really the trenching, getting your property ready to install an EV charging station. So if you think about the work that gets done, bringing it to where your panel might be, or where your service is, to the charging station itself. So we're looking to pay about 100% of that, or up to 100% of that cost for the customer. We do have cost caps right now, which is $5,700 if you don't need a new service from National Grid, $6,700 if you do, per port. So like a dual port station, this is on the commercial side, would be up to $13,400 for the installation. And then on top of that, we're providing funding for the stations themselves. And it really depends on if you're a municipality. This is where it gets stickier than it was in phase one. And the reason why it gets a little stickier is because in phase three, we want the state wants all these programs to look similar. So we got together with Eversource and Unitil, and we're trying to have the same program guidelines. In phase one, we offered funding for level two stations. Eversource did not, and except for in environmental justice community. So when we came together now, okay, so do we offer money for the charging stations? Is that part of our proposal or not? And so we compromised, and for municipalities, we will, for ports, and it's where it gets sticky, like I said, for ports 3 through 10, for non-municipalities, for ports 5 through 10. So we are funding some of the ports, but if you're installing 10, 20 stations, we may not be providing funding for all the stations, although on the Make Ready or the infrastructure installation side, it doesn't matter. We're funding anything from 0 to 20, 30, however many ports you want to install. So it only affects the charging station costs, and the majority of the costs are actually in the installation anyways. So that's the good news. And that we're covering such a large part of that cost. We're also offering in phase three a stipend for networking. We do require these projects to be network, especially if we're in order to receive a rebate for the station, has to be publicly accessible. So for publicly accessible stations, we also offer a stipend for networking, and it's $480 a port, which is supposed to cover $120 stipend for up to 4 years. So, why do we require it to be networked? It's really, if you're not networked, there's a lot of things that you can't do with the station. Probably, if you're installing a small station at a residence, probably a level 1 station, that's a very slow trickle station, but some are installing level 2 stations, you don't need networking. But for commercial customers, for publicly accessible customers, you should have that, because there's so much, and I know Chris can speak to this better than I about, how you are able to charge for using the station, how you're able to tell somebody, okay, your car is charged, can you leave so somebody else can use the station now? There's all kinds of things that you can incorporate in there. And as a utility, we're not looking for specific individual users. We're trying to really look at trends. And so without that networking information, it's like a subscription, you cannot, we wouldn't know, are these stations that we're investing so much money in, are they actually being used? I mean, we want to make sure we're getting, what we're paying for. And if they're not, if there's one segment that just doesn't use them, one, maybe trying to think, well, we have public multi-unit dwellings and fleets and workplace is our general categories. Somebody installed them, we paid for them, nobody's using them, or something like that. So we just want to really look at that information, look at trends. Should we restructure our rates? There's all kinds of things we look at when looking at that information. So I'm really going way down the road here.
No, this is exactly why you're on. I appreciate it, Marie. Like that, this is good information. My other question for you is this: how does the state's program tie into your program, and how do you work with the state?
So the state has there's some funding that they offer for buses and for other things, but there's a couple of the largest state program we're working with a lot that we coordinate with is called Mass EVIP. Mass EVIP is a organization out of the Massachusetts Department of Environmental Protection, and they offer rebates as well, or they offer funding. And typically the way it works is if you are a National Grid or Eversource customer, and we require you to apply for public funding, the state wants you to apply, the DPU wants you to apply for public funding, because if the funding comes from Mass EVIP, it reduces the load on our own ratepayers who are responsible for funding our programs. So it makes sense that you would need to apply for public funding first, or at the same time, I should say. And what happens with that is if you're approved, they have similar programs, then we would deduct whatever you're approved from our calculated rebate. So we work together with them. They provide us with reports so that we know what customers are being funded. But it's a great way, again, to reduce the impact on our own ratepayers, or it actually could help us get more stations installed because we could use that budget more efficiently. So what was I going to say about so you do need to apply for Mass EVIP if you're eligible. Not everybody's eligible. A customer has to have at least 15 employees, I believe, and you can go on their website and find out what all their eligibility rules are. But it is a good place to start.
I always tell customers across the country that, if you can try and find the right time to make your investment, because sometimes this can be really expensive. And Massachusetts is kind of the shining example right now of state and utility working together to help electrify and make it easier to make that transition. So that's why I want to go through that, just because it really is unique. And if you are looking to install charging stations in Massachusetts, there really is no better time than right now, but also it's probably the most lucrative circumstance in the United States. And we have a national grid, EverSource in the state to thank for that. So my next question for you, Marie, sort of jumping away from National Grid and that specific program, but obviously, like National Grid has other counterparts across the country that are doing similar things that you're learning from. You're maybe taking some things from, maybe they're taking some things from you. What are some of the other things that are happening in the industry that sort of shape how you think about things?
Oh, that's a loaded question. I'm a little bit more pictured into the what we're actually doing. But, we do know that we were one of the first to do a pole mounted demonstration. We did a pole mounted pilot in phase one where we know it's really important. How access to charging stations is key. And so if you live in an apartment building and you just have on-street parking, where are you going to charge where are you going to charge your vehicle? It's not encouraging you to get one if you don't know what are you going to park it down the street or wherever. So we did a pole mounted project where we had charging stations installed on poles, and the hoses, what do you call those, that come down, and you could charge your car. And then we tried them because it was one at a golf station, so it was kind of cool just to watch it come down. You plug it in your car. It's a level 2 station. You get an hour or two out of it, you top your car off, and you're all ready to go. So we did that in Melrose, and I believe there are about 15 of those installed. We got a lot of attention from that. I think it was in the Globe as well. It was on a lot of news articles, and because it's really one of those. That's a customer we need to address. One of our most important customers is the multi-unit dwellings. The other thing we're looking at doing this year is we're looking at how can we, in areas that are a little bit more constricted with capacity constrained, how can we get charging stations into those areas? So that's something we're looking in phase two as kind of a development project. How best, what are we looking for? You're looking for no charging in the area within a mile, for example. You might be looking for where there's a lot of multi-unit dwellings or something like that, where there's a lot of demand for charging. We want to, how can we mix that with, solar charging, battery storage? So we're looking at in the future, we only have funding for so much of these kind of I want to call them pilots, but these kind of demonstrations. So, but that's one of our off things for phase three.
Yeah. I think it's so interesting. Like utilities are in such a strong position to influence and test new things out that we haven't tried before. And let's face it, we say this, we're in the wild, wild west right now, and it's important to test out new solutions to figure out what makes sense. Like multifamily use cases are just more challenging than other ones to get people to buy electric cars. And I love that. Where in Melrose can people go if they want to see that use case?
Well, there's one at Hood Golf Course, so you can check that out next time you go golfing. And they are on different streets in Melrose. You got to look up, but pay attention while you're driving. Safety moment.
Cool. I am gonna go check one of those out. That's really interesting. So the next thing I wanted to talk about is related to demand charges, right? Demand charges is like this inconvenient truth that exists, and it's understandable why demand charges exist. They make sense. I think most people aren't aware that they exist, and once you explain what they are, and just so that viewers know, demand charges are a charge on an electric bill for generally a commercial electric bill, where you're paying for the peak amount of power you're using in any given month, the peak 15-minute interval. And the reason why it's challenging for EV charging stations is because of the load profile of charging stations, especially when it's tied to an existing building load or something like that, where you have peaks in power. Sometimes for fast chargers, those peaks are multiple Walmart supercenters at one time. And then maybe the stations aren't used for a while. So it's just this really unique load profile. And sometimes it can be a little bit more expensive on the electric bill. And I know that National Grid and Eversource have been working with the state to come up with a rate that could potentially help customers on the demand charge side. So I just wanted to give you a chance to talk about that for a second.
Sure. So we did come up with an approved rate now. It's been approved, I think, in July. It's a demand charge alternative rate. And essentially what it, as Chris explained, it's looking at trying to mitigate those peaks so that a customer doesn't, a customer isn't discouraged from installing EV charging station. It's typically it makes the most sense for customers who have, DC fast charge, those level 3 stations, because they draw the most electricity. We don't, you have to be at least 50 kW station, which is a small station, but you think of the level 2 stations that somebody might have for a commercial building, or some even have at their homes, are anywhere from 6 to 11, maybe even up to 19 kW, just to give you an idea. But most of them would be in that like 6 to 11 kW range. So a DC fast charge is that much bigger, and you might see some upwards of 300 kW on the highway corridor at those convenience stops. So that's the concern. If somebody charges their car for at least 15 minutes, it's going to hit that peak for the month. So we developed a rate. It's kind of, you have a lot to balance there, because there's a lot of infrastructure on the utility side involved, a lot of costs involved in order to support that station. And that, we really, as a company, we really have to make sure that those costs are covered. So that's one thing we have to balance against the costs to the customer. But for the demand charge alternative, and like I said, you might have 1 or 2 DC fast charges that you're separately metering, or you might have a bank of 10, 20 level 2 stations. As long as they're separately metered, then you would be eligible for this rate. And it doesn't matter if you install these through our program or if you installed them before, as long as they're separately metered. It's a 10-year program. So we're almost done with, no, not quite with the first year. Well, we're about 6 months into the first year. So there's plenty of time left to sign up. But we look at your load factors. So it has to do with what your usage is, during the day versus overall what your usage is during the month. And if your load factor, and there is a calculation involved, and if your load factor is less than 5%, then we're going to provide 100% demand charge discount. So we're going to take care of that. The first year, we're just going to provide 100% no matter what your load factor is. But in years 1 and in the years after that, then we will provide a discount, and it goes down. The discount starts to drop a little bit in percentage wise until you hit 15%. Once you hit a 15% load factor, then the discount goes away, because it makes much more sense. You're spreading those kilowatt hours over the whole month, and that's what you should be paying for. The stations are being used as designed, so it
Yeah.
makes much more sense.
Yeah, I love the National Grid's doing that. And I think this is going to be used across the country. Oh, sorry. I got a phone call, so I'm just going to continue on. I think this is going to be used across the country as an example of how utilities can make it easier for station owners to make investments in EV charging that are serving their employees, that are serving their customers at their location. So I love that this is happening. And if anybody ever wants to understand that load factor calculation or understand tariffs, it's certainly something, if you reach out to EV Ready, we can have a discussion about. But I love the strategy. It makes all the sense in the world, and it's leading the way. So thank you. Um, Maria, I just have one last question for you. You've been in the industry at the most interesting time. Well, as have I, but you from the most interesting perspective where you're working with so many different companies that are out there right now. And you know better than anybody that there are always new companies entering the industry that are doing certain things. So without without naming any names or any putting anyone in a negative light or mentioning brands, could you talk a little bit about some of the things that you really like that you're seeing, and then some of the things that you think could be improved by the charging vendors in general?
Yeah. Well, we have a process where we onboard charging stations. If there's a customer, as a National Grid customer, you have to use one of the stations that's on our eligibility list, and that's on our website. And if it's not there and you want to use another station, you can do that. You just have to apply through an RFP process. They just have to fill out some paperwork. So we are looking for things, for example, those that are easily networked. We found there's some stations that aren't always compatible on the networking side with the station itself, and there's been some issues with that. So we want to make sure that we're able to collect that networking information. That's why that's important to us. Um, uh, and we also, the key thing is the uptime. We don't want to have stations out there. We don't want to get complaints, of course, but I mean, we want the complaints. We want to know, but we're hoping that we
Yeah.
don't get complaints about stations not being operational, because that discourages anybody from purchasing an EV. So that is really a key component. And so again, we vet these stations out. There are certain qualifications that they need to meet and to be on our eligibility list. That doesn't mean that some of them you might have a separate, a different problem with. And so, and without naming names, I know we did have a problem with one of them last year. And that, it's funny because word gets around and everybody just stopped buying that equipment, and then and moved on to some. But we have all kinds. Some that have the whole the panel inside the building, and then they just have a couple of. It's very easily accessible, so you don't have to put bollards to protect them. Then we have the traditional ones that you see installed that look like kind of like boxes with the two plugs on both sides. Um, so, we like to see that they're operational again, and we find out because we collect networking information. And if all of a sudden we're not getting the networking information anymore, we know that the station is not operating, and we reach out, what's going on? Why aren't we getting the networking information? So that's again, that's really the most important thing, is that they're working and they're compatible. And our we're looking for stations that are compatible with every car. That's one thing, is, we have that. We weren't able to offer rebates for Tesla stations because they're only good with Teslas. And, this is a public program. All our ratepayers are paying for it. So we want to make sure that accessibility is key as well.
Yeah.
Um,
You just hit on such an important point. I think, like, generally when you're not in the EV space and your boss tells you got to go find a charging station and figure out how to get it paid for in some way. If you're not in the industry, you probably assume that this is what I would do, is that an electric plug works as well as a gas plug. But I think the reality is gas stations are 100 years old, and they're at the end of the growth of their technology, whereas charging stations are in its infancy, and so many companies are entering the space right now that sometimes maintenance and uptime can be a little bit of an afterthought, and it's almost impossible to um, pick one company for a program. You want to make sure that you have optionality, but also making sure that those stations that you're saying are approved are being supported. It's a challenging uptaking, I imagine. And I think for anybody who's looking to install charging stations, I think it's important to talk to an expert to understand the dynamics of different charging stations and how they're made, and how they're supported, and the details of the warranty that's being offered, and who's executing on that warranty, and all those different things. But I love that you brought that up, because that is a real challenge in the industry that I'm sure you're trying to wipe out as much as possible for your program.
Oh yeah, yeah. Um, the other thing that we kind of, as you were talking, I was thinking about the other thing that we're pretty happy about is that we feel like we're making a difference in the whole space in terms of more jobs, more jobs, bring on more jobs, because we don't say you have to use this vendor or that vendor. You can use whoever you want. Yes, we have a list of vendors that participate, but you can use whoever you want. Some utilities say, no, you just have to, we're only using, these two vendors or three vendors or whatever. So that has been great. And the thing is we're not saying to anybody, you can only use this station or this station or this station. As long as you provide us, so that, the manufacturer can provide us with the information we're looking for, and it passes what we're, our review, then that's fine too. So we're trying to be, as, what do you call it? Agnostic as
Agnostic.
possible. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
and just and invite everybody into this space, and everybody who has the capability to be in the space, but with some vetting, of course. But and that's really, I think, been why we did so well in phase one as well.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, everything from a guy in Boston who's been in the industry. I You've done a great job. National Grid's done a great job, and definitely grateful to have such a progressive utility in the state. Well, I think that is all the time we have now. So, Marie, thank you so much for joining. Really appreciate it. And for those, yeah, no one else probably knows this, Marie and I go to the same coffee shop. So, I'll see you at Zoomy soon.
Okay. Thank you, Chris. Thanks for having me.
Thank you.
All right.